in this video, I'm going to be talking about my student G who went from a B to an A star in his AS physics content, and I'm going to share with you the exact 3-week structure that you will be able to use for yourself to get those same results. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first part of this is really reversing the idea of what you might be thinking of in terms of revision. Because when we initially think about revision, our mind automatically goes to, okay, that means I need to first read through my notes or make notes or really go to my textbook and see if I actually understand everything. You're going to flip that on your head following this 3-week structure. And your first task is to break all of that content you are trying to learn up into as many subtopics as you need. So quickly, as an example for my student G, we had 18 different subtopics. So electricity, for example, would be a topic, but within electricity, that was broken down into IV curves was a subtopic, internal resistance was a subtopic, etc., etc. And then once you've got those subtopics, what you start with doing is I gave G 30 minutes of exam questions for each subtopic. Now, these weren't necessarily exam questions from his exam board. Actually, I pulled them from all different A-level exam boards because the point of this phase is just to get to grips with what bits of content you understand and what bits of content you don't understand. And honestly, an A-level physics question for AQA is just as good as an A-level physics question for OCR. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but what if I literally know nothing? Well, remember, G was actually on a B, but G's main issue was the reason he was on a B was because he was really good at maths. So he was able to use the formula book, look at some problems, try and apply the right maths in the right places, but he didn't really understand the fundamental concepts and why he was applying the maths to those questions. And that what was really capping him at the B and wasn't able to get to the A star. But it would depend on the subtopic. So some of these subtopics, he'd find them super easy and he'd be getting 20 plus out of 30. And then some of the subtopics, he'd be stuck on like 5 out of 30. So you give it a go, basically. And then when you give it a go, you don't look at the mark scheme just yet. What you do is now go back to some way to actually revise the information that you didn't know. For G, that was usage of my video lessons, and in those lessons, I keep everything as active as possible. So it's doing examples, it's exam questions within the lessons. They're not just lectures. But why this really works is even if you got 5 out of 30, you're now coming to that content with a more laser sharp focus as to what is the information you actually need to be absorbing, and you have primed your brain ready to absorb that information. So it makes it clearer what you need to be focusing on, and it means that when you do receive that information, you're more likely to absorb it. You're viewing that information through a context of what are the kinds of questions that I'm asked about this, which really, really helps. Okay, and then once you've done that refresh and try and keep that active, so again, it's not just reading the textbook. Once you've done that, you go back to that same pack of exam questions and have a go at doing as many more as you can with that new information. Then you go to the mark scheme. Now, this part is really important, and if you've seen some of my videos, you might have seen this before. You're starting a mistakes log. So what that means in practice is just a plain exercise book, and you have the questions you got wrong, your incorrect answer, the correct answer, but crucially, you have the line of logic as to why you were wrong in the first place and why the correct answer is correct. And if you want an actual example of that, then check out my other video here where I go through examples of using this mistakes log. Now, of course, even having done this, there may be things that you've looked at the mark scheme, you still don't really understand them, you've looked at the video and you still can't actually figure it out for yourself. Now, in those cases, because I was working with G, we would do sessions together, and that's exactly what we were focusing on in those sessions, mopping up anything from these little 30-minute subtopic tests that he did not fully understand. But obviously, if you don't have a tutor, you can do other things to do this part for yourself. So you could get someone like an A-star friend, so someone in your class who is super good at physics and might be able to help you do that. Of course, you can ask your actual teacher either in class or stay behind after class, or you can use AI. Feed AI all of those questions that you still don't quite get and see with a back and forth conversation if you can get that understanding and that reasoning back out. So once you've done that, you should have covered everything, all of that content. For him, there were 18 subtopics in total. He was doing 2 a day. That would be sometimes 2 hours of work because it was 30 minutes of the questions, but you try the questions, then you might have to watch a video, then you go back to the questions, then you have to fill in your mistakes log. So it was probably more like 2 hours of work than 1 hour of work for those 2 subtopics. But this was revision time. You know, you need to put in work for your A-levels if you want to get the results. So that's what he was doing. So that took him about 1.5 weeks to get through that. Then stage 2 was to actually do hour-long exam question packs, but this time for a whole topic. So for example, all of electricity. And the reason we were doing this is there's 2 reasons really. One is spacing. So he'd been through all of those subtopics once, but now he was revisiting that same material about a week later. How much of that had he retained, had he remembered? Of course, he was meant to flick through his mistakes book before attempting that electricity test. So that would have helped to remind him of some of the mistakes he was making. But that really helped to then cement all of that progress and all of that knowledge that he had undergone in the last 1.5 weeks. So he'd do those, they'd be an hour each. And again, he would then have the mistakes log. And again, we would have sessions together where we'd either mop some of this stuff up, or I would just push him a little bit further. Now, with these ones, I did tend to, he was AQA, I did tend to move towards more AQA questions, but I didn't want to use any questions that he was going to do in the next phase of this. So again, there were a few questions mixed in from other exam boards. Okay, and in total, I broke this up into 6 topics for his AS content. So there were 6 of these 1-hour assessments to have a go at. And then we got to the final bit. Now it was time to look through all of those mistakes logs and do some actual complete past papers. And these ones were meant to be in timed conditions. And really we were using our sessions together at this point to talk through any kinds of exam techniques, any mistakes he was particularly prone to making, and just doing those finishing touches and polishes. And so he did 4 of those past papers in total, and then he went to sit his actual past paper at school, where he was awarded that A star for his predicted grades. And that's it, that's the 3-week structure. Hope you found that useful. If you are interested in my personal help with improving your physics grades, then I'd really recommend you check out Physics with Iz. Check out the link in the description below.